Hey guys, tonight we're going way back, like before Rome, before Egypt, before anyone had figured out plumbing or taxes. So if you're settled in, lights dimmed, cat comfortably positioned on your chest, let's drift back to a time when the world was quiet, muddy and deeply confused about how years worked. Our story starts in ancient Mesopotamia, or as historians like to call it, the place where humanity decided to make things complicated. It's often described as the cradle of civilization, but the people living there probably didn't feel particularly cradled. The region was a rough neighborhood between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what's now southern Iraq. It flooded when you didn't want it to, dried up when you needed it most, and was filled with gods who all seemed to have anger management issues. And yet, out of this delightful chaos, came the Sumerians, the world's first known civilization. They invented writing, built the first cities, and recorded their kings in what might be the most over-the-top royal brag list in human history. The Sumerian King List. Now, if you've ever read it, you'll know it starts off completely normal until it doesn't. The earliest kings supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years each. One guy, Ululam of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years, which, if you're keeping track, is roughly the time it takes for a glacier to melt. According to the list, the gods literally handed kingship down from heaven. Then it was passed from city to city: Eridu, Batabira, Larak, Sipa, Sherapakich, getting their turn to host a god-approved monarch with an apparent allergy to mortality. It reads less like history and more like a fever dream written by someone who mixed theology with bad math. But here's the thing. The Sumerians weren't trying to fool anyone. Their sense of time wasn't like ours. To them, massive numbers weren't literal. They symbolized greatness, divine favor, or cosmic order. So when they said 28,800 years, it might have just meant really important guy, or the flood took longer than expected. Still, it's fun to imagine old King Ululam waking up every morning for 28,000 years, checking on his ziggurat construction project like, still not finished. Yeah, me neither. Let us float a little further downstream to understand why the Sumerians cared so much about these rulers in the first place. Life in early Sumer wasn't exactly peaceful. The land was fertile, but the climate was moody, and rival city-states were basically toddlers fighting over a sandbox. The gods were unpredictable, the weather was worse, and if something went wrong, it was usually blamed on whoever had recently become king. So, the kings weren't just political leaders, they were divine middle managers, supposed to keep everyone, including the gods, happy. This setup gave rise to an early form of royal anxiety. Every harvest, every flood, every eclipse, people looked to the king for answers. If the barley crop failed, maybe the king had annoyed Enlil, the sky god. If a river overflowed, maybe he forgot to sacrifice the right number of goats. Being king in Sumer wasn't glamorous. It was like being the manager of a divine call center where all the customers were furious deities. And so, when they wrote their history, they made their rulers sound cosmic and immortal. It was a way of saying, our kings weren't just politicians, they were the very structure of the universe, which, to be fair, is a bold marketing strategy. But eventually something happened that the Sumerians never quite got over. The flood. Yes, that flood. The same one that later pops up in Babylonian myths, the Bible, and a dozen other flood stories around the world. The King List literally splits history in two, before the flood and after the flood, like a cosmic before and after photo. Before it, kings ruled for hundreds of centuries. After it, they barely made it past a few decades. Either the gods got stingier with lifespans, or the scribes finally bought a calendar. Post-flood kingship began in the city of Kish, which apparently had quite the comeback energy. The first king after the flood was Etana, who the texts call the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign lands. Basically, Sumer's first overachiever. He even shows up in later myths riding an eagle into the sky, possibly the earliest known case of Icarus syndrome. And if that sounds dramatic, don't worry. The Sumerians kept the tone consistent, grand, divine, slightly absurd. Every ruler was the chosen of Anu or beloved of Inanna or appointed by the gods, which makes you wonder how much paperwork that involved. Now, the real historical shift was subtle but huge. Before the flood, the kings were practically gods. After the flood, they were humans pretending to be gods. That's where the idea of divine kingship starts, the notion that your ruler wasn't just chosen by the gods, but maybe was one, at least on the weekends. As centuries passed, cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur rose and fell, each insisting their king was the best, the oldest, and probably the tallest. Political stability was rare, but divine justification was not. Everyone had a god on speed dial. Uruk, for example, gave us Gilgamesh, the legendary king who may or may not have existed but definitely had main character energy. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh, he was 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, and entirely too dramatic. He built walls, fought monsters, annoyed gods, and eventually went on an existential road trip to discover why humans have to die. Spoiler, he didn't like the answer. Gilgamesh's story reflected something deeply Sumerian, the unease with mortality. When your ancestors supposedly ruled for 30,000 years, dying in your 50s probably felt like a ripoff, so they made their kings semi-divine to soften the blow. Let's pause and appreciate how early all of this was. We're talking around 2800 BC before the pyramids, before Stonehenge finished construction, and long before anyone thought of alphabet soup. The Sumerians already had bureaucracy, taxation, irrigation systems, and written records. They were the first to sit down and say, maybe we should keep track of who's in charge and for how long. And that small administrative decision to write down their kings ended up echoing through thousands of years of history. Every later civilization, from the Akkadians to the Babylonians to the Assyrians, copied the idea, because nothing says power like a neatly curated list of everyone who has ever ruled you. Of course, not all kings were created equal. Some were probably real people. Others were wishful thinking. By the time scribes compiled the King List, around 2100 BCE, they were already looking back over a millennium of confusing oral traditions and mythical rulers. Trying to make sense of it must have been like writing a Wikipedia article based on rumors and temple gossip. Still, they managed to build a coherent narrative, and that's what makes the King List so strange and so hypnotic. It's a bridge between myth and history. You can almost feel humanity trying to wake up from its own dream and write down what it remembers. Let's gently drift toward one of the next great names on the list. Mebraj of Kish. He's often considered the first verifiable king in history. Unlike Alalulam or Etana, we actually found inscriptions bearing his name. He ruled sometime around 2600 BCE, fought with other cities, and was probably the first person to ever get written about by name in history. Imagine being the first human to achieve recorded existence. No pressure. His reign marks the slow dawn of real chronology. Years start to make sense. Lifespans are mortal again, and gods take a slight step back. Humanity, for better or worse, begins to write its own story. And that's where the Sumerians truly shine. Beneath all the divine pretension and impossible timelines, they were trying to understand what it means to govern, to build, to die, and to be remembered. In their own poetic way, they invented history as we know it. So when the King List says that kingship descended from heaven, maybe it wasn't about gods at all. Maybe it was about how leadership, writing, and civilization itself seemed like something that came from beyond human reach, something divine in the sense of being new. We'll drift deeper into that thought next time, as we follow the kings from Kish to Uruk, to Yort, and into the wild political soap opera that was early Mesopotamia. Because, as you'll see, the only thing longer than their reigns were their grudges. Hopefully you've got a blanket, something warm to drink, and an open mind for ancient people who really took divine customer service to the next level. Tonight, we drift deeper into Sumer, the land where every royal family tree looked more like a vine, and every king thought he had direct access to the gods. Last time, we ended with Mebraj of Kish, history's first confirmed monarch. Well, at least the first one whose name survived on something more durable than clay gossip. His rule probably looked impressive from a distant stone temples, workers hauling bricks, priests waving incense, but the truth is, early kingship was still improvisational. The Sumerians were figuring out what being in charge meant while they were doing it, and that meant a lot of experiments. Kish liked to act like it had a monopoly on kingship. Its rulers claimed the gods had chosen their city as the divine capital of Earth, which was awkward because every other city thought the same thing. Uruk, for example, wasn't having it. Their kings were basically celebrity priests with hero complexes, and they weren't about to take orders from Kish. This brings us back to Gilgamesh, who, legend or not, represents the transition from myth to ego. The guy supposedly ruled Uruk for 126 years, but he lived like someone who thought immortality was a team sport. He built massive walls, fought mythical beasts, and then went on a long, sad vacation to find eternal life. Now, whether or not Gilgamesh existed exactly as written, there was likely a real ruler behind the legend, someone powerful enough to leave an echo. Archaeologists even found the ancient walls of Uruk enormous constructions that made later kings jealous for centuries. And while Gilgamesh might have had divine parentage in the stories, the truth is probably more human, a successful warlord who became myth in the retelling. What's as fascinating is that the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written down a few hundred years later, doesn't glorifying him for being divine. It shows him as a man realizing that even kings can't outrun death. For a society obsessed with eternal rule, that was a pretty sobering bedtime story. Meanwhile, over in Kish, things were less philosophical. The kings there preferred to keep their divinity simple. You obey, or you get conquered. Take King Aga of Kish. For instance, he tried to bring Uruk under his control, sending demands that basically read, submit, or we'll make your city regret learning agriculture. The people of Uruk turned to Gilgamesh, their very mortal yet extremely confident king, who politely declined to surrender. A war followed, probably more of a local turf battle than an epic clash of nations, but in the end, Gilgamesh won. The tablets say he broke the yoke of Kish, which is Sumerian for take that. That victory was symbolic. It showed that divine kingship could be challenged by human strength and charisma. The gods might pick the king, sure, but apparently so could the voters in Uruk. It was the beginning of a very slow realization. Political power didn't always need a divine permission slip. But don't worry, the divine part of kingship wasn't going anywhere yet. After Kish and Uruk had their moment, the kingship supposedly descended to Ur, another major city-state. This was where rulers started building more permanent monuments to themselves, like the ziggurats, massive stepped temples that were part spiritual tower, part city hall, part ego project. The kings of Ur had names that sound like fantasy characters: Mesopotamia, Onapada, and Alulu. Try saying those 5 times fast. Mesopotamia is the most famous of them. He called himself king of Kish, even though he wasn't from there, which, in ancient Mesopotamian politics, was the equivalent of stealing someone's LinkedIn title. He ruled sometime around 2500 BCE, and during his time we start to see real records of trade, laws, and diplomacy. Ur was wealthy, connected to distant lands by trade routes that brought in lapis lazuli, gold, and exotic woods. The kings loved to show off their prosperity. Especially in the royal cemetery of Ur, they buried themselves with absurd amounts of treasure, servants, and musical instruments. Because nothing says eternal rest like a full orchestra of people you took with you. Archaeologist Leonard Woolley discovered these graves in the 1920s. Among them was the famous Queen Pwabi, who wasn't technically a king but ruled with enough flair to deserve an honorary mention. Her tomb was loaded with gold headdresses, lapis, necklaces, and beautifully crafted lyres. It's possible she was part of Mesopotamia's dynasty, or maybe she was the one actually running the show while the men pretended to. Pwabi's burial is fascinating because it blends opulence with ritual tragedy. Many of the attendants buried with her were likely sacrificed, probably to serve her in the afterlife. It's grim, yes, but also deeply revealing about how the Sumerians saw death. To them, the king or queen didn't stop ruling after death. The afterlife was just another bureaucratic department. Let's take a quiet step forward in time, to another legendary figure, Lugalbanda, supposedly one of the kings of Uruk, and possibly Gilgamesh's father. His name means mighty king, though his main accomplishment, according to the myths, was getting stuck in a cave and surviving on magical food until the gods rescued him. So, not exactly a resume builder, but it worked out. What's charming about Lugalbanda's stories is how human they are. He's brave, yes, but also scared, lost, and dependent on divine intervention. You can feel the Sumerians starting to let their gods and kings become characters, not just titles. Myth was softening into something like literature. And speaking of softening, this was around the time the Sumerian world started to get crowded. You had city-states everywhere, each with its own god, king, and military ambitions. Lagash, Umma, Adab, and Shuruppak were constantly in each other's business. It was like a divine reality show where everyone believed they were the chosen one. In Lagash, we meet another fascinating ruler, Urukagina, around 2350 BCE. He became famous not for conquest, but for reform. He claimed the previous kings and priests had grown corrupt, so he introduced what might be the world's first recorded legal reforms. He abolished certain taxes, limited the power of temple officials, and even made laws to protect the poor from exploitation. Of course, he justified all of it by saying the gods told him to. Divine kingship meet early populism. Urukagina's laws didn't last long. He was soon defeated by Lugal-Zagasi of Umma, who then proclaimed himself ruler of all Sumer. His inscriptions are some of the first to use that phrase, king of the land, a title that sounds grand but also screams mid-level empire. Lugal-Zagasi's success didn't last long either, because right on his heels came someone with an even bigger vision, Sargon of Akkad. Now, Sargon deserves an entire episode on his own. But for now, let us just say he was the overachiever who decided the gods weren't enough. He wanted geography too. Around 2330 BCE, Sargon conquered all of Sumer and beyond, creating what many call the world's first empire. He was born a commoner, allegedly found in a basket floating down a river, sound familiar, and rose to power by sheer force and charisma. His rule marks the end of the purely Sumerian city-state era and the beginning of the Akkadian Empire. But before Sargon there was chaos. Kings fought, gods were invoked, and cities burned, all under the divine excuse that it was destiny. It's one of history's recurring themes. Every ruler believes the universe personally handed them the crown, and yet, beneath all the divine propaganda, something deeply human shines through. The kings wanted immortality, yes, but not just through lifespan or conquest. They wanted to be remembered, and in that the Sumerians succeeded spectacularly. Because here we are, 5,000 years later, still talking about them in the middle of the night. Let's float out on that thought, because next time we'll follow the thread into the Akkadian age, when divine kingship stopped being metaphorical and started being law. Kings no longer just spoke to the gods, they started speaking as them, good or maybe half asleep, which honestly is the ideal state for this journey through the ancient world. Tonight we were gliding into the age when kings stopped just talking to the gods and started being them, or at least, convincing everyone else they were. We were leaving behind the patchwork of squabbling Sumerian city-states and drifting into a time when one man decided that wasn't enough. His name was Sargon of Hot, and his story reads like an early prototype for every empire-building ruler that came after. Ambitious, ruthless, charismatic, and very fond of his own legend. According to later inscriptions, Sargon wasn't born royal. He was a foundling. His mother, a priestess, set him adrift in a basket on the river. The gods apparently liked the drama because he survived, grew up serving a royal cupbearer, and then through what must have been a particularly bold career move over through his master and took over the throne, because why work for a king when you can just become one? He called himself King of Akkad, founding a new city somewhere north of Sumer. Its exact location, still uncertain, much to the frustration of archaeologists everywhere. The Akkadians were Semitic-speaking people who lived alongside the Sumerians, and Sargon managed to unite them under one rule, effectively creating the first real empire in recorded history. Now, empire might sound grand, but in reality it was probably a messy, loosely connected network of conquered cities, held together by fear, taxes, and Sargon's impressive PR campaign. He styled himself as King of the Four Quarters, meaning the entire known world, which was generous considering his empire didn't even cover all of Mesopotamia at first. But in royal terms, accuracy was optional. What made Sargon so effective wasn't just conquest, it was branding. He redefined kingship. Instead of being the chosen servant of the gods, he positioned himself as their equal. Inscriptions call him the Great King, the Mighty King, the one favored by Inanna. He wasn't just leading armies, he was rewriting the divine job description. This shift changed everything. Before Sargon, power in Mesopotamia was regional, fragile, and constantly interrupted by priestly authority. After Sargon, it became centralized, militarized, and permanent, at least in theory. He conquered all of Sumer, parts of Elam to the east, and even marched up toward the Mediterranean coast. The Akkadian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to modern Syria. For a man who started as an orphan, it was an absurdly impressive career trajectory. But it wasn't just about land. Sargon introduced a new style of rule, one that was both practical and psychological. He stationed loyal governors, installed Akkadian as the administrative language, and made sure everyone knew the king's face, literally the famous bronze head from Nineveh. Thought to represent Sargon or his grandson Narration, is one of the earliest lifelike royal portraits in history. The message was clear: the king sees you, even if you don't see him. And he wanted to be remembered. His inscriptions speak in the first person, unusual for the time. I am Sargon, the mighty king. You can feel the ego radiating off the clay. Before him, kings were anonymous intermediaries for the gods. After him, they were personalities. Of course, the higher you rise, the more divine paperwork you have to fill out. Sargon faced plenty of rebellions. The Sumerians weren't thrilled about being ruled by a northern upstart who just declared himself cosmic royalty. But Sargon crushed revolts one after another, reportedly rebuilding cities that rebelled and occasionally removing their walls just to make a point. Still, even he couldn't hold everything together forever. His empire stretched too far, too fast. After his death, probably around 20 to 79 BCE, his sons Remosh and Manishchu inherited the mess. Both spent their reigns suppressing uprisings, and both were eventually assassinated, which, in Mesopotamian politics, was basically the traditional retirement plan. Then came Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, and the man who perfected the art of royal arrogance. If Sargon thought he was chosen by the gods, Naram-Sin went one step further. He became one. His most famous monument, the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, shows him towering above his soldiers, wearing a horned crown, the symbol of divinity. He's literally carved as a god among men, trampling his enemies while climbing a mountain. The message isn't subtle. You're looking at a living deity. Please bow accordingly. And people did. He ruled at the empire's peak, overseeing a realm so vast it needed an early version of international mail to stay connected. Trade flowed from Anatolia, Syria, and the Persian Gulf. Cities like Acd, Nippur, and Ur thrived. The economy boomed, scribes got busier than ever, and the gods probably got tired of all the dedication plaques. But the more divine Naram-Sin became, the more fragile things got. Declaring yourself a god has a way of making everyone else nervous, especially priests. The religious establishment didn't love being outranked by a mortal with a crown. Eventually, that tension boiled over into rebellion and, according to legend, divine punishment. Later Mesopotamian stories accuse Naram-Sin of angering the gods by destroying the temple of Enlil at Nippur. Whether that actually happened is unclear, but the myth stuck. His empire was said to have fallen as a result, a cautionary tale about hubris that every later king ignored. Historically, the Akkadian Empire did collapse around 2200 BCE, not because of divine wrath but because of something much less poetic: climate change and political chaos. A prolonged drought known as the 4.2 kiloyear event devastated crops and trade routes. Cities were abandoned, rebellions broke out, and invaders from the north, the Gushens, moved in. The Guchians were described by later Sumerian writers as uncivilized mountain people, which probably meant they didn't have ziggurats or good table manners. The Sumerians hated them, calling their rule a time when no one brought offerings to the temples. In other words, things had gone completely off script. It's poetic, in a sleepy sort of way. Sargon and Naram-Sin built the world's first empire, declared themselves divine, and then watched it crumble within a few generations. For all their attempts to live forever in glory, the desert winds had other plans. Still, their idea of divine kingship never disappeared. Later rulers from Babylon to Persia to Rome borrowed it, refined it, and pretended it was their own invention. Sargon's ghosts haunted every empire that came after, whispering you could be more than human. When the Akkadian Empire finally disintegrated, Sumerian city-states made a brief comeback. Kings in Lagash and Uruk tried to rebuild the old order. The most successful of these revivalists was Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BC. Ur-Nammu did something revolutionary not by declaring himself divine, but by writing laws. The code of Ur-Nammu predates Hammurabi's famous one by centuries. It established fines and penalties for crimes, protected the vulnerable, and formalized justice. For once, power wasn't just about divine favor, it was about order. Under Ur-Nammu and his successors, Sumer experienced a kind of renaissance. They rebuilt ziggurats, revived old hymns, and brought back a sense of stability. It was as if the civilization took a deep breath after centuries of war and said, let's try being reasonable for a while. But even this golden age didn't last. Around 2000 BCE, Amorite invasions and shifting alliances pulled the region apart again. The Sumerians, the people who'd invented kingship, writing, and cities, slowly faded from the historical spotlight. Their language became ceremonial, a sacred tongue used by scribes who no longer spoke it. And yet, their ideas survived. The Akkadian and Babylonian empires that followed inherited everything: religion, writing, bureaucracy, and, most importantly, the belief that kings ruled by divine right. So, when you see later rulers from pharaohs calling themselves gods, to Roman emperors demanding worship, you're seeing Sargon's shadows stretching across millennia. It's strangely comforting. Even 4,000 years later, the same human pattern repeats. People rise from nothing, build something vast, believe they're chosen, and then watch it all unravel. Maybe that's the real hidden truth behind the Sumerian King List: not that their kings lived 28,000 years, but that every ruler, in their own way, keeps trying to. Let's let that thought settle. The flicker of eternal power, always slipping away, always rewritten in clay by the next hand. You made it back. Or maybe you just drifted here half asleep, which is fine. That's kind of the point. Tonight we're re-picking up in the soft afterglow of chaos after Sargon's empire had collapsed. The Gutians had stormed through like uninvited guests, and Mesopotamia was basically in a long, awkward recovery phase. This next part is about how humanity, for the third or fourth time in the same region, tried to rebuild everything it had just lost. Because apparently, the Sumerians didn't know how to quit. After the fall of Akkad, the region fell into what historians politely call a dark age. Not pitch black, just dim enough that the records get fuzzy. The Gutians ruled for maybe a century. The Sumerians later described them as hairy, barbaric, and lazy, which probably says more about Sumerian snobbery than Gutian behavior. According to one ancient lament, they knew not the proper rites, they brought no offerings, they cared not for justice. In short, terrible house guests. But the thing about chaos is that it never lasts forever. Somewhere around 2100 BCE, out of the ruins and confusion, a city decided to make a comeback. That city was Ur, and leading the charge was a man named Ur-Nammu who, in a weird twist, might have started as a governor under a Gutian puppet regime. He didn't stay anyone's subordinate for long. Ur-Nammu founded what we call the third dynasty of Ur, or Ur-3 if you want to sound academic. He rebuilt Sumer piece by piece, not just its walls and temples, but its sense of identity. His reign was less about divine conquest and more about divine management. You can picture him as the ancient world's most responsible project manager. While Sargon had gone for glory, Ur-Nammu went for structure. He standardized weights and measures, codified laws, revived the old Sumerian language for official inscriptions, and got the irrigation systems back on track. Basically, he took a 200-year-old empire that had collapsed in flames and turned it into a well-run bureaucracy with good handwriting. But the most striking symbol of Ur's revival was architecture. Ur-Nammu started building a massive temple to the moon god Nana, the great ziggurat of Ur. You've probably seen photos of it. That towering, stepped structure rising from the desert like a stack of ancient stone clouds in its prime. It wasn't just stone and dust. It was brightly painted, decorated, and crowned with a shrine at the top where priests could talk to the gods from slightly better cell reception. The ziggurat wasn't about human power, it was about order. After centuries of divine kings claiming to be gods themselves, Ur-Nammu shifted the tone, that gods were once again above humanity, literally and symbolically, and the king's job was to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. And yet, for all his humility, Ur-Nammu still made sure people knew who to thank. His name appears everywhere on bricks, tablets, and temple dedications. Ur-Nammu, the mighty king of Ur, builder of the temple of Nana. It's modest, in a royal way. He also left behind one of the earliest known law codes, centuries before Hammurabi. It's written in Sumerian, and while only fragments survive, What we do have is surprisingly humane. It deals with theft, assault, and property disputes, but it emphasizes fines over physical punishment. If a man injures another man's eye, he shall pay half a mina of silver. So, less eye for an eye, more invoice for an eye. That tells us a lot about the tone of your three: pragmatic, organized, still spiritual but less violent. The Sumerians, after generations of chaos, were tired. They wanted predictability, and Yonamu gave them that. After his death, around 2095 BCE, his son Shulgi took over. Yonamu was the builder, Shulgi was the showman. He reigned for nearly half a century and turned Ur into something like the Paris of the ancient world: cultured, artistic, self-satisfied, and just a bit too proud of itself. Shulgi continued his father's reforms but added flair. He declared himself divine, which, to be fair, had become a regional tradition at this point. His inscriptions are full of self-praise. I am the hero, the king of wisdom, whose power is unmatched, and my personal favorite, I can run from Nipper to Ur in one day, which is about 100 miles even if you're divine. That's a suspiciously fast marathon time. Still, Shulgi wasn't all talk. He expanded the empire, strengthened the economy, and built an elaborate state system that historians sometimes call the Sumerian bureaucratic machine. Every city had governors, scribes, and tax collectors, grain quotas, livestock tallies, temple donations. Everything got recorded. It was efficient in the way only an ancient civilization that invented writing could be. The sheer volume of tablets from this period is overwhelming. We have receipts for beer rations, lists of temple musicians, inventories of goats, and bureaucratic memos about brick deliveries. It's strangely comforting. Even 4,000 years ago, someone was writing, received 2 oxen, 1 defective. But Shulgi's perfectionism had a dark edge. To maintain control over such a wide realm, he demanded absolute loyalty. Provinces were tightly monitored. Governors acted like regional CEOs, reporting back to the capital. The king's word was law, partly divine, partly administrative, entirely unquestioned. Over time, cracks began to show. The empire was rich but overstretched. It depended on a complex system of labor and tribute from distant lands. When those roots faltered through war, drought, or simple exhaustion, the machine started to sputter. After Shulgi's death, his successors Amas and Shusan, and finally Ebesin, inherited a glittering but fragile world. External pressures grew. Nomadic groups, especially the Amorites from the west, began moving into Sumerian territory. They weren't invading in armies. They were migrating slowly, settling, trading, and sometimes causing trouble. At first the Sumerians tolerated them, but as resources tightened, tension grew. Cities turned inward, temples stockpiled grain, and the once unified administrations started to panic. Letters from governors to the king start sounding desperate. The barley is gone. The enemies are at the border. Send help. Help rarely came. By the reign of Ebesin, around 2020 BCE, Ur was collapsing under its own weight. The Elamites invaded from the east, sacking cities along the way. Trade routes disintegrated. The once mighty ziggurats turned from symbols of divine order into watchtowers for bad news. There's a heartbreaking text from this period called the Lament for Uri. It's written like a funeral dirge for a city. The narrator describes Ur in ruins. Its people scattered, its gods abandoning their temples. The storm has swept the land. The people wail. The gods have left their dwellings. You can almost hear the quiet grief of a civilization realizing its story is ending. And that's how Sumer, the place where writing, kingship, and cities began, faded into history. The Akkadians, Amorites, and Babylonians absorbed what was left, blending Sumerian culture into their own. The language that once recorded the kings who ruled for 28,000 years slowly became a scholar's tongue, read but not spoken. But the Sumerians left an invisible mark. Every civilization that followed copied their ideas. They taught the world that power comes from order, that history should be written down, and that the gods always deserve an expensive temple upgrade. Their kings may have exaggerated their reigns, but their real achievement was something stranger and more lasting. They built a system that remembered itself. Every brick, every tablet, every law was a way of saying, we were here. So when the King List tells us that kingship descended from heaven, maybe that wasn't a myth. Maybe it was a poetic way of saying civilization itself felt like a miracle, something that came from beyond human hands, fragile and divine all at once. As the centuries rolled on, new powers rose. Babylon, with its own kings and gods, would inherit the torch. The names would change, but the obsession with divine order would remain. Humanity never quite got over the idea that power comes from the heavens. Let's end here quietly with that image. The last king of your watching is City Fall, the moon god's temple fading into dust, and somewhere a scribe etching the final line on a clay tablet before setting it to dry in the sun. Thousands of years later, we still find those tablets, still read their stories, and still feel the faint echo of the people who built the first cities, ruled the first kingdoms, and wondered what it all meant. Alright, let's dim the lanterns again. When we last left off, Ur had fallen, its temples looted, and the great ziggurat stood in silence. You'd think that would be the end of the story, the credits rolling over the ruins of Sumer, But of course, civilizations don't really die. They just leave behind ideas, and those ideas find new hosts. In Mesopotamia, the new hosts were the Amorite semi-nomadic tribes who had been drifting into Sumerian lands for decades. They didn't come as conquerors at first. They came as workers, traders, and mercenaries. Over time, they settled, adopted local customs, and started calling themselves kings. That's how the next great phase of Mesopotamian history began, not with an invasion, but with a quiet assimilation. The Amorites founded new city-states over the bones of the old ones. Isin, Lhasa, Eshnunna all rose to prominence in the century after yours fall. Each claimed to be the rightful heir of Sumer's legacy. Each kept the old gods, the old rituals, and even the old language, Sumerian, though by now, hardly anyone spoke it. It had become like Latin in medieval Europe, sacred, ceremonial, and mostly used by scribes who wanted to sound fancy. Out of these squabbling Amorite city-states, one would rise higher than the rest. Its name was Babylon. Now, Babylon didn't start out as a major city. For most of early Mesopotamian history, it was just another settlement on the Euphrates, known as Babili, meaning Gate of God. But under a clever Amorite ruler named Hammurabi, it became the center of the world, or at least, the world as they knew it. Hammurabi came to power around 1792 BCE, which is over 3 centuries after yours fall. That's the same time gap between the fall of Rome and the rise of Charlemagne. Long enough for people to romanticize the past, but not long enough to forget it. Hammurabi used that nostalgia to his advantage. He presented himself as a restorer, the man who would bring back the glory of Sumer and Akkad. He didn't claim to be divine, but he did claim divine endorsement. The gods, he said, had chosen him to bring order and justice to the land. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it's the same narrative Sumer had used 1,000 years earlier. The torch had passed, and Babylon was the new flame. Of course, Hammurabi wasn't just a talker. He was a strategist. He built alliances, broke them when necessary, and played rival cities against each other until Babylon emerged as the supreme power. By the time he was done, he ruled nearly all of southern Mesopotamia, the first true empire since Sargon's Akkad. But what really made Hammurabi's name endure wasn't war, it was law. You've probably heard of the Code of Hammurabi, that tall black stone covered in cuneiform, with a carving of the king receiving authority from the sun god Shamash at the top. It's one of the most famous artifacts from the ancient world, and it's often presented as the first law code. That's not entirely true. Remember, Ur-Nammu and others came before him, but Hammurabi's was the most ambitious. The code wasn't a law book in the modern sense. It was a statement, a piece of royal propaganda disguised as jurisprudence. The message was simple. The king is the guardian of justice. It begins with a long prologue where Hammurabi lists his divine credentials, his good deeds, and the gods who love him. Then come about 280 laws, ranging from property rights to marriage, inheritance, wages, and criminal punishment. The tone is practical, but the morality is clear. Everyone has their place, and justice means maintaining that order. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If a builder builds a house and it collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a son strikes his father, his hands shall be cut off. Brutal, yes, but systematic. It's not that Hammurabi invented fairness, it's that he codified hierarchy. The laws make sharp distinctions between classes, noble, commoner, and slave. The punishment for the same crime could differ wildly depending on who you were. Justice was proportional, not equal. In other words, don't mess with people above your pay grade. Still, it was revolutionary for one reason. It was written down. For the first time, the law was public. Anyone, at least, anyone literate, could look at that stele and see what was expected. It created accountability. Maybe not democracy, but the faint, early shadow of it. Through Hammurabi's code, the Sumerian obsession with order reached its most refined form. Writing had begun as a way to count barley. Now it defined civilization itself. But empires, like crops, have seasons. After Hammurabi's death, Babylon weakened. His successors couldn't hold the vast territory together. The old pattern returned: invasions, rebellions, shifting alliances. In the north, the Hittites swept down briefly and plundered Babylon. In the south, new dynasties rose. Yet Babylon refused to vanish. It lingered like a ghost that wouldn't move on. Over the centuries, it was conquered and rebuilt again and again by the Kassites, the Assyrians, and later, the Neo-Babylonian kings. Through every cycle, its cultural DNA carried the imprint of Sumer. The scribes kept writing in cuneiform, long after the spoken languages changed. The temples to Marduk echoed the layout of earlier shrines to Enlil and Nana. The priests still traced their authority to the same celestial myths. It was as if the Sumerian world had simply changed costumes but never left the stage. By the time of Nebuchadnezzar II, around 600 BCE, Babylon had become something mythic. His city was the crown jewel of the Near East, home of the legendary Hanging Gardens, towering ziggurats and wide avenues lined with blue-glazed lions. Travelers who saw it claimed it was like walking through heaven on earth. Ironically, that heaven was built on ideas born 2,000 years earlier in the mud-brick cities of Sumer. The gods had new names. The empires had new banners, but the rhythm was the same: order from chaos, glory from dust. And even after Babylon itself fell, when Cyrus the Great of Persia marched in and ended its independence forever, the ideas didn't stop there. The Persians borrowed them, so did the Greeks, so did Rome. The concept of divine kingship, written law, organized administration, all of it came from that first spark in Sumer. Think about that. A people who lived before iron, before wheels with spokes, before even the alphabet somehow created the framework for every civilization that followed. The Sumerians are gone. Their language is silent. Their cities are sand. But every time we make a law, every time we write history, every time we imagine gods looking down from the sky, we still speaking a little Sumerian. That's the real legacy of kingship descending from heaven. It wasn't just about who ruled, it was about why we believe in rule at all. That something higher, something cosmic, gives structure to the mess of human life. The Sumerians weren't perfect, but they were the first to chase that idea, and it never left us. Their kings may have claimed to live for 30,000 years, but in a way, they weren't wrong. Their reign, their influence never ended. It just changed names. Let's get comfortable, maybe dim the screen a little, take a slow breath. Tonight, we're not wandering through the ziggurats or counting barley tablets. We're refloating through time itself to the moment when the very words of Sumer slipped quietly into silence, and later, when they were pulled back from the dead by a handful of slightly obsessive scholars with magnifying glasses. You see, every civilization thinks it'll last forever, especially the old ones that carve things into stone. But the Sumerians, despite their clay obsession, weren't immune to time. Their cities fell, their gods got renamed, and eventually, their language, the oldest written language we know, stopped being spoken. The funny thing is, nobody noticed when it happened. There was no grand funeral for Sumerian, no ceremony where someone said, "And thus ends the world's first language." It just faded, slowly, like the sound of rain after a storm. By around 1800 BCE, the everyday people of Mesopotamia were already speaking Akkadian, a Semitic language more closely related to Hebrew or Arabic than to the older Sumerian tongue. It was practical, easier to use, and more flexible. Over time, Akkadian took over trade, politics, and daily life. Sumerian became the language of priests and scribes, a sacred relic. Imagine if Latin had survived for 1,000 years after no one actually spoke it. That was Sumerian. Used, copied, memorized, but not lived in. Still, it refused to disappear completely. Generations of scholars in Babylon and Assyria kept it alive. They copied old hymns and royal inscriptions like monks in medieval Europe. They studied it, taught it, and treated it like divine code. Their tablets even included little bilingual dictionaries, Sumerian on one side, Akkadian translation on the other. So yes, the ancient Mesopotamians basically invented Google Translate, but eventually even that academic afterlife ended. By around 500 BCE, no one could really read Sumerian anymore. The priests who once whispered its words to the gods were gone. The libraries turned to dust. The last clay tablets got buried under layers of newer civilizations, and then came silence. For 2,000 years, to the Greeks and Romans who later wandered through the ruins of Mesopotamia, these lands were already ancient. Herodotus saw the remains of Babylon and called them the work of giants. He had no idea that long before Babylon, an even older world had existed. The names Sumer and Akkad were lost, their kings forgotten, their myths swallowed by the desert. Fast forward a few thousand years and enter the 19th century. Europe was deep into the age of exploration, archaeology, and empire. Scholars were digging up everything from Egyptian tombs to lost Assyrian palaces. The Middle East was basically one giant treasure hunt for history. In the 1840s, a British adventurer named Austin Henry Layard started excavating at a site called Nineveh, in modern Iraq. What he found was astonishing. The palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal with thousands of clay tablets covered in mysterious wedge-shaped marks. Those wedge marks were cuneiform, the same writing system that had started in Sumer nearly 3,000 years earlier, but no one could read it. Not a single living person on earth. At first, everyone thought it was some sort of decoration. Then a few realized it was writing, and then came the great race to decode it. It was like the 19th century version of cracking the Rosetta Stone, except with more tea, dust, and colonial mustaches. Three main scholars took up the challenge: Henry Rawlinson, a British officer in Persia, Edward Hincks, an Irish clergyman, and Jules Aupert, a French linguist. Rawlinson was the one who risked his life to climb a massive cliff in modern-day Iran called Behistun, where an inscription carved by the Persian king Darius I had been sitting there for 2,500 years. It was written in three languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. That trilingual text became the key. Like a Mesopotamian Rosetta Stone, it let Rawlinson compare known words from Old Persian with unknown signs from Babylonian. Step by step, symbol by symbol, he began to decipher it. And then something strange happened. As they worked through the texts, the scholars realized there was another language hiding underneath Akkadian, an older one. Its grammar was weird. Its words didn't fit. Its structure didn't match anything known from Semitic languages. That was Sumerian, piece by piece. From dusty fragments and bilingual tablets, the long-dead language was reborn. It wasn't easy, even after decades of work. There were debates about whether Sumerian was real or just a special style of Akkadian. Some scholars refused to believe that an entirely different language had existed in the same region. But by the late 1800s, the evidence was undeniable. The texts were too old, too distinct, too strange to be anything else. By the early 20th century, the word Sumerian was back in human vocabulary for the first time in 2 millennia. Now imagine that, a language that died before the pyramids were finished, brought back to life by people with magnifying glasses and patience. There's something poetic about that. And the more they read, the more bizarre and fascinating Sumerian culture turned out to be. Their myths were raw and oddly familiar. There was a great flood story long before Noah. There were tales of the underworld, goddesses of love, kings who thought they were divine, and heroic demigods like Gilgamesh whose story would later echo in every epic from Homer to Hollywood. All those fragments, all those scratched wedges, they rewrote the timeline of human civilization. The Victorians had thought Egypt was the first, then suddenly Sumer appeared from the dust, older and more complex than anyone imagined. It forced historians to redraw the entire map of history. Writing hadn't begun on papyrus along the Nile. It had begun on wet clay in the muddy fields of southern Mesopotamia. And here's the quiet irony. Sumerians had invented writing to track their barley and sheep. They never meant it to outlast them. It was a practical tool, not a legacy project. Yet it became the very thing that resurrected them. Those scribbles on clay turned into the world's first time capsule messages sent from people who didn't know what the future even was. Now, every time archaeologists find a new cache of tablets, the same cycle continues. A forgotten god gets a name again. A lost king gets a voice. And the dust stirs just a little, as if the old Sumerian world sighs in recognition. If you listen closely or if you read enough of their words, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of a civilization that refused to stay buried. Sumer, the land where kings ruled for 241,000 years, has no living descendants, no surviving temples, no spoken language, but somehow, its voice is still here in the quiet spaces between the wedges of clay, in the words we use for law, order, and writing itself. Because that's the strange magic of history, it never truly ends. It just waits, buried, until someone cares enough to dig it up. Or welcome to the soft hum of history that never really stops. Tonight we float gently over the echoes of kings, the dust of ziggurats, and the faint outlines of empires long gone. If you've been following along, you know we've wandered from the fantastical lifespans in the Sumerian King List, through Akkad's first empire, Yor's revival, and the Babylonian inheritance. Now, let's step back and see how all of that shaped the world that came after. The Sumerians weren't perfect, but they were foundational. Imagine the first people to sit down and say, we need laws, cities, kings, gods, and scribes to make it work. It was chaotic, yes, but it created a template. And every empire that followed borrowed pieces of it, consciously or unconsciously. Take kingship. The Sumerians taught the world that rulers were more than just wealthy generals. They were intermediaries with the divine, organizers of civilization, and central figures in bureaucracy. When Sargon of Akkad declared himself king of the four quarters, he wasn't inventing the idea of empire from scratch. He was refining the notion of kingship that had already been written into the clay of Sumerian tablets. Later, Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, the pharaohs, and even Roman emperors would echo this structure. Gods endorse the ruler organizes life, and everyone else tries to survive. The bureaucracy itself is Sumer's gift. Before them, life in the cities was messy. Sumerian scribes, with their wedge-shaped stylus, turned chaos into lists. Grain tallies, tax receipts, legal contracts, temple inventories, all meticulously recorded. This system of administration made empires possible. Without it, nobody could run more than a single city-state. With it, an empire could stretch hundreds of miles. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians adopted the same techniques, improving on them, but always standing on Sumerian shoulders. Law, too, was inherited. The Code of Unamu and the later Code of Hammurabi may seem harsh to modern eyes, but the concept of codified, publicly recorded law was revolutionary. Before that, justice was arbitrary, based on who had the most influence or the largest club. Sumerian kings introduced predictability. People could, in theory, know what would happen if they acted one way or another, and predictability is civilization's silent backbone. Religion carried forward as well. Sumerian gods didn't disappear, they evolved. Enlil, Inanna, Nana, Utu, and Enki lived on under new names, in new cities, and within new empires. They became part of a mythological thread connecting Sumer to Babylon, Assyria, and eventually even parts of the wider Near East. Their personalities and quirks influenced ideas of divine justice, morality and cosmic order and, in turn, human governance. Even writing itself, arguably the most durable of Sumer's inventions, set the stage for history. Clay tablets may have been primitive, but they allowed knowledge to outlast lifetimes. Empires could be remembered, kings could be chronicled, myths could survive, and bureaucracy could function. This idea that knowledge can be recorded and passed down is the thread linking Sumer to every literate society since. And there's irony in all this. The Sumerians, obsessed with claiming that kingship descended from heaven, were themselves mortal. Their cities crumbled, their language fell silent, and their kings were forgotten in myth and exaggeration. Yet the system they built, the ideas they codified, the patterns they set, those outlasted them. In a way, they achieved a sort of immortality, not in the flesh, but in influence. Think about it. The pharaoh's concept of divine kingship, Hammurabi's laws, the Syrian bureaucracies, and even the administrative frameworks of Greece and Rome all echo Sumer. They borrowed, adapted, and perfected, but they didn't reinvent. The first bricks, the first tablets, the first lists of kings, those came from Sumer, and perhaps that's the quiet lesson here. The Sumerians taught humanity that order, structure, and belief mixed in the right proportions could survive the collapse of cities, the death of kings, and the silence of language. Empires may rise and fall, but systems of governance, law, and religion have a stubborn way of enduring. So, as we drift toward the end of tonight's segment, imagine the Sumerian cities under the soft desert sky, the ziggurats catching the last light of sunset, the scribes quietly etching records into wet clay, the kings dreaming, probably in overlong lifespans, of eternal rule. They knew nothing of the future empires that would trace their ideas, yet their legacy shaped them all. The Sumerian King List, with its fantastical reigns, isn't a literal record. It's a symbol of ambition, imagination, and the human need to measure time, power, and history itself. And even if the numbers were absurd, the story is true. Kings rose, empires formed, civilizations collapsed, and ideas persisted. Every empire after Sumer, knowingly or not, carried its DNA, and perhaps that's the most remarkable thing of all, that a civilization vanished physically, yet survived conceptually, whispering across centuries, quietly shaping the world we inhabit today. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, remember the Sumerians not for their impossible reigns, but for their enduring contributions. Writing, kingship, law, temples, and myths, all seeds planted in the fertile mud of southern Mesopotamia, growing in ways they could never have imagined. Let's settle in for the final stretch. Dim the lights, stretch your legs, and let the soft hum of ancient Mesopotamia drift around you. We've wandered through impossible reigns, sprawling empires, fallen cities, and divine drama. We've met kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, gods who quarreled like children, and scribes who quietly preserved civilization on clay tablets. Tonight, let's take a gentle look back at it all. The Sumerian King List may be the most audacious historical document ever produced, kings living tens of thousands of years. It reads like fantasy, yet it tells a deeper truth. People have always dreamed big. They have always measured power, imagined the divine, and tried to understand time. The exaggerations, the impossible lifespans, are not mistakes. They are a testament to human imagination and our fascination with authority. Even though we know the numbers are impossible, the stories behind them are not. Each name represents a person, a dynasty, a city striving for permanence in an uncertain world. Each king was real, ruling over people who farmed, prayed, built, and wondered about life, death, and the stars above. And while the Gushans, Amorites, Babylonians, and Persians came and went, the Sumerians' influence remained woven quietly into the fabric of civilization. Their kings may have been mythic, their reigns exaggerated, their language lost for millennia, but their legacy is concrete. Clay tablets survive in museums. Ziggurats still rise from the desert sands. Tales of Gilgamesh, Inanna, and Enlil endure. Law, administration, writing, and the very idea of empire, all of it bears Sumer's fingerprints. It's humbling to think about. Empires rise and fall, languages die, and yet, the patterns set by the first city builders echo in every corner of the modern world. Democracy, bureaucracy, codified law, literature, they all trace back, however faintly, to the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerians invented civilization in ways we still rely on today. And perhaps there's a quiet lesson here, just right for bedtime reflection. Ambition matters, but so does preservation. A king may pass, a city may fall, a language may vanish, but the ideas endure. Clay, mud, ink, and memory can outlast stone. Humanity's greatest superpower may not be strength, wealth, or conquest, but the ability to pass knowledge forward, from one generation to the next. So, as you drift toward sleep, picture the soft glow of a Sumerian ziggurat at sunset, priests murmuring to the moon god Nana, scribes etching tiny wedges into wet clay, and kings dreaming of impossible lifespans. Imagine the slow rhythm of life in your Uruk, and Lagash, a rhythm that persisted through centuries of chaos, collapse, and rebirth. The King List may have claimed 241,000 years of rule, obviously exaggerated, delightfully absurd, but the true span of Sumerian influence is longer than time itself. Every empire, every law, every city that came afterward owes a whisper of its structure. its stories, and its dreams to these first architects of civilization. Let the weight of that sink in gently, not as a lesson in mortality or empire, but as a reminder of continuity, of endurance, of the quiet power of human ingenuity. Even in dust, clay, and silence, life persists. Even in myth, exaggeration, and legend, meaning survives. And with that thought, let's rest. Let the soft pulse of 4,000 years of history lull you. Let the kings, gods, and scribes fade into the quiet desert night. And remember, civilization, like sleep, is a slow, steady process. From clay tablets to digital screens, from your to your room tonight, the story continues, quietly, persistently, endlessly. Good night, and may the echoes of the first kings guide your dreams.